There's a popular story about the golf champion Ben Hogan. After Hogan had won a major tournament, a reporter asked him, "How is it that under pressure you're able to hit so many miraculous shots?" After reflecting for a moment, Hogan said, "Well, I guess I'm just lucky." "But Mr. Hogan," the reporter replied, "you practice more than any golfer in the world." "Well," Hogan said, "the more I practice, the luckier I get." When we hear stories of successful people, we often assume that they are simply lucky or they have lots of natural talent. Well, luck and talent are factors in being successful, but Malcolm Gladwell, in his best-selling book Outliers, says that people who are successful usually put at least 10,000 hours into practicing the particular skill they need for success. Here's an excerpt from that book, Outliers, in which he is discussing the study by J. Anderson Erickson from which he derived his 10,000 hour number. The striking thing about Erickson's study is that he couldn't find any natural musicians who floated effortlessly to the top while practicing a fraction of the time their peers did. Nor could he find any grinds, people who worked harder than everyone else yet just didn't have what it takes to break the top ranks. Their research suggests that once a musician has enough ability to get into a top music school, the thing that distinguishes one performer from another is how hard he or she works. That's it. And what's more, the people at the very top don't work just harder, or even much harder than everyone else. They work much, much harder. The idea that excellence at performing a complex task requires a critical minimum level of practice surfaces again and again in studies of expertise. In fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise: 10,000 hours. The other key factor for successful people, beyond luck, talent, and practice, is something Gladwell calls potential. People don't rise from nothing. We do owe something to parentage and patronage. The people who stand before kings may look like they did it all themselves, but in fact they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies that allow them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways others cannot. It makes a difference where and when we grew up. The culture we belong to and the legacies passed down by our forebears shape the patterns of our achievement in ways we cannot begin to imagine. It's not enough to ask what successful people are like, in other words. It is only by asking where they are from that we can unravel the logic behind who succeeds and who doesn't. In other words, Gladwell is suggesting that successful people are the product of specific communities who help them along the way. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he's writing to them about the same thing: the importance of a community if we are to be successful Christians. Paul gives the Ephesians clear guidelines of how to avoid behaviors that will damage their community and keep them from being successful. Now, his guidelines are nothing new. We've all heard them before. Be careful with your anger, don't lie, watch your tongue, stuff like that. Perhaps because this advice is so familiar, we don't pay much attention to it. And if we don't pay attention to it, we certainly are not going to practice it. And as Gladwell points out, practice makes the difference. Practice is essential. So let's take a closer look at some of Paul's guidelines and consider practicing these guidelines intentionally. Putting away all falsehood, let all of us speak the truth to our neighbors, for we are members of one another. In other words, don't lie to each other. And maybe we have to explore that term lie. Just last Sunday, I had an interesting conversation during coffee hour about telling lies. It was suggested that an average person tells 11 lies per day. And so, of course, I challenged that and said, well, it depends on what's a lie. In other words, to me, at that point, leaving out some critical information is not necessarily a lie. That's a sin of omission, right? It's a half-truth. But at the end of that conversation, I was convinced, yeah, that probably is a lie. That probably is one of those 11 occurrences that happen on an average day. So I don't know about you, but I know that I need to practice speaking the truth if I want to be a successful Christian. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Notice Paul doesn't say, don't be angry. There is a time and a place for righteous anger, especially when we are facing injustice. Jesus got angry quite often. But anger is also dangerous. Rage can consume us if we let it. At the end of the day, we let go of our anger and give it back to God. If we are reflecting God's anger at injustice, we need then to give it back to God where it belongs, or it can become an occasion for sin. Now, this is not a natural talent for some of us. To get good at expressing God's anger appropriately requires lots of practice. Let no evil come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up as there is need, so that your words may give grace to those who hear it. I think the person who made up that playground ditty, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me," must have lived a very sheltered life. Words can hurt. Words can hurt very deeply. And once we utter those words, we can never really take them back. Yes, we can apologize, but there's a good chance those words are still going to linger in the air for a long, long time. Perhaps we need to practice biting our tongues. I know in today's modern culture that's not a popular idea, and if you don't believe me, just watch some of the political ads. Some of the political ads. They get pretty ugly. But perhaps if we do something that seems unnatural today and practice biting our tongues, we could be a better community. Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. Now here Paul is talking about human bitterness, human wrath, human anger, human malice, which we sometimes mistake for God's righteous anger. When we go into a rage over something someone else has said or done, we need to stop sometimes and check if this isn't perhaps a small injustice that we've worked into a big deal in our heads. And then maybe, instead of flying off at the handle, we can forgive them as God has forgiven us. Forgiving those who don't deserve forgiveness. That is not easy. It takes lots of practice, maybe even 10,000 hours of practice to be successful at that particular skill. So do you want to be a successful Christian? Nurture your community and practice the skills that Paul suggests. As he wrote to the Ephesians, may we be imitators of God as beloved children and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself